which, oh, there we go. Oh, that wasn't on the recording. Okay, good. But this will be, and then it'll be really confusing. All right, let me share, and you should be seeing my slides right now, right? Yes? I can't tell. Nobody's saying yes. Oh, thumbs up. I see it. Okay, people doing thumbs up. I can't see the chat very well when I'm in this mode. So I guess when I'm sharing, I can't see the chat. So you'll have to manage that for me. If there's somebody that actually wants to say, wait, there's got to be a way I see a chat. Push this button, meeting chat. Okay, well, that's over there. Excuse me for a second while I slide things around. I think we'll still do okay for time. Okay, slide this around. I have a tiny screen, a tiny 13-inch screen, so I have to move everything around in the right way. But here we go. So this is my talk, my recently created talk on Flutter, which is the past, present, and future of Flutter. And I am suggesting in the slides that this may be your next cross-platform UI framework if you're looking for one, or it may be something you're already actually using. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about, just to give you an overview, because some of you probably don't know anything at all about Flutter, except what I'm about to say. I'm going to give you sort of an overview of where we are right now. We're going to go into details about that towards the end of the talk. But I wanted to kind of give you at least something so that you understand when I'm talking about the history, what the history is all about. Then I'm going to talk about the past. How did we get here? It's a long history, actually. I am going to talk about the present, and that'll be the details. So I'll talk about what Flutter is today, what it became as of yesterday, things like that. And then I'll talk about the future, and I'll provide some links at the end for where to go for further information. And somehow I think the slide deck, I'll make it available through you guys somehow to so you can click on the links rather than trying to write anything down. It's just too tricky. Let's talk about the what's there today. So what we have today, what is Flutter? It's a framework providing a flexible user interface and powerful user interface, and for many, many architectures. And by many architectures, I mean pretty much everything with a screen. So we're talking first about mobile, iOS and Android. This is sort of the original purpose of Flutter. So that, of course, is at its core business and continues to remain the most mature and most supported, but all these other things are being added over the years. Web is interesting, taking the same code base and using it to make pretty much the same exact display, but on the web. Linux, Mac, Windows, embedded, all sorts of things. We've got desktop, we've got mobile, we've got embedded, and web. There are about 5 million developers around the world by estimation, based on looking at things that I don't know. That's what they said yesterday, so I figured probably right. But the other thing that is important to note is that in the Google and Apple stores, their estimate is somewhere around 750,000 apps right now that are actually written in Flutter. There's actually a trick that if you download an app and you want to find out it's written in Flutter, you can actually do something to the app that only Flutter does. And so it's a nice little telltale. I'll tell you at the end if we have time. It's also a very popular project on GitHub. So all the source code to Flutter and Dart is being edited in the public on GitHub. And when you look at contributor count, and this is the count of all the different people who have provided pieces for it, it's the number 3 project on GitHub behind VS Code and Home Assistant. So it's very popular on GitHub. It is powered, as I mentioned a bit ago, by the Dart language. Dart is a unique creation of Google. They created it just for having the technologies that we're going to talk about. But the interesting thing about Dart is as you start to play with Flutter and work with Dart, is that Dart has other uses besides Flutter. You can use it on command line applications. So I've ended up replacing a number of my utility programs with a Dart program that actually starts a lot faster and runs a lot faster than, say, the equivalent shell script. So that's really cool. And that works with, again, Linux, Mac, and Windows, and embedded. If you can run it on a Raspberry Pi, we can compile and target that to be able to run stuff there. And also for server-side execution. So in the cloud, you can be running Dart applications. For example, you can run Google Cloud Functions and AWS Lambda directly with Dart being the execution engine. You can also have websites being served by it, so it becomes a smart website. You can also just have operational daemons, things that are running in the background all the time. You can write those in Dart without any problem. And you can also use it with a browser by compiling it to JavaScript, where you're essentially manipulating the DOM. So think of it as like a different style of JavaScript or TypeScript. It's basically, you can do all that stuff. It can move everything around that JavaScript can move around, because essentially you're compiling to JavaScript. So of course you can do everything that JavaScript does. And there was a package set up that actually got me interested in Dart for the web very early on, called Angular Dart. Some of you may have heard of Angular JS or Angular TS. This is a parallel project to that, to do the same thing in Dart and have it essentially have Dart and HTML together. Real cool things. And there are some other things too that you can do with the web and with Dart. So I've mentioned Dart a number of times. How did it get here? Well, Dart has been around since 2011. So this is not a new application, because it was originally intended as a JavaScript replacement. And people were looking, the Chrome team was looking at how, the JavaScript engine was really being pushed to the max, and JavaScript had some inherent flaws. Some of those have been corrected in things like TypeScript, but at the time this is happening, TypeScript isn't, it's still pretty early in the cycle, so it wasn't an option for them. And so the idea was that Chrome would have both the original V8 JavaScript engine as well as the Dart engine. And in fact, when they put Dart inside Chrome, they called it Dartium, which is pretty good. And that was the idea. So in other words, let's have a new execution engine that is a more modern language, that maybe is strongly typed, things like that, things that JavaScript couldn't reach directly. Now that plan was later abandoned when it actually was pointed out to people, hey, look, you can't just put it in Chrome. A lot of people don't use Chrome. So JavaScript is everywhere. We're going to have to stick with using JavaScript. There's just no way around that. And so they abandoned the plans. And what's weird is the headlines all read, oh, Google abandons Dart. No, they were abandoning the specific plan of requiring the Dart VM to be embedded in everybody's browser, although that was the original strategy. But they abandoned that. What they did instead is they got the Dart to JavaScript translation to be better and better and better. And in fact, it's really amazing now, the kinds of code that it generates to go from Dart to JavaScript. And by the way, when I say they, I'm meaning Google. I don't work for Google. I'm a Google developer expert, but all that means is I have a relationship with Google that allows me to be a liaison between y'all and the guys back in Mountain View. So, anyway, so that Dart to JavaScript just got better and better and better. And it's amazing now. You can do full debugging and incremental loading and all sorts of, it's amazing stuff. And back in these days, your main interface was the single IDE of Eclipse with a plugin that the Google team had come up with to be able to edit Dart code. And it was pretty awkward to use. You know, it was sort of a one-off deal, created from scratch. Pretty silly stuff. But that's what we were stuck with. And you could also run Dart scripts as a command line, or you could also then run them in Chrome, either in JavaScript mode. So you could translate your Dart to JavaScript and run it in Chrome, or you could run this special Chrome that has Dart as a VM, and that's called Dartium. So that was the two ways you could execute Dart with Chrome or on the command line. And then fast forward a couple more years and we have Flutter. So Flutter was originally a project to take a look at, again, a different way of interacting with the DOM. The DOM, the document object model, the thing that is like, you know, when you say H1 or list item or whatever, all these different tags translate into nodes inside the DOM. And JavaScript had been pretty successful at manipulating the DOM, but JavaScript had its own flaws. So they wanted to look at, what if we didn't have to implement all of the existing DOM? What if we could start from scratch and just take the rendering engine and put a thinner layer in front of it? And that became the Sky project. And so this was done by the Chrome team, trying to look at the next generation of how to interact with the interactive web. The project that they were doing was sort of a weird hybrid between JavaScript and what later became Dart, and ran on Android only. It was trying to be a mobile application as well. So they had to target ARM with the compilers and things like that. So it was an experiment, but it led to them realizing that, yes, this is a good strategy, and it also ports nicely to mobile. And so Android mobile ended up being sort of the primary target of this. But again, it was the Chrome authors that were doing this initially. In fact, some of the early copyright notices on some of the Flutter code still say copyright by the Chrome authors. I think they got most of them by now, but they're trying to get rid of all those. So they publicly released Flutter 1 in 2018. And so that was some number of years ago, but not 6 years ago. And I've seen recruiters ask me for, do you have 6 years of Flutter experience? And I would say, no, because nobody has 6 years of Flutter experience. It has not existed that long. And so, yes, I just write 5 now by everything because it seems to work pretty well for them. Anyway, so Flutter 1, and Flutter 1 was very primitive. It also, it produced a update to the language called Dart 2. Now, Dart 1 was very JavaScript-like in the sense that variables didn't have a type. They could hold anything that you throw at them. The values were of varying types, and the only way you would blow something up was at runtime, where you tried to do a method on an object that it didn't know how to do. And that was the only time you ever got any kind of feedback. Dart 2, though, in order to actually make it possible to do the kind of speed and services that that Google wanted to get to, introduced strong type safety. And what that means is that the variables themselves have types. So now we can see that we're trying to put a non-integer into an integer variable. and it can blow up at compile time. And this is definitely a step upward. And it's only one of the two major jumps that have been made. I'll get to the other one in a second. Okay, so Flutter 2 came out a few years later, and that added, to everyone's surprise, web support. So we had iOS, we had Android, and we could draw pretty much pixel for pixel the same pictures on both of them and have the same interactions and everything. But web was still this other weird thing that you still had to use JavaScript with, or you could use Angular Dart until they abandoned that. And but what this project was originally called Hummingbird, was to go ahead and put the web on. Go ahead and put the Dart written program that uses the Flutter toolkit directly on web by essentially drawing on a canvas on the web. And it was very effective, worked really well. Really, at the beginning was a little difficult, but it got better and better over time. And also in Flutter 2, we saw the beginnings of desktop. So a Linux desktop or a Mac desktop or a Windows desktop, all three of those started to be released almost simultaneously. And it meant that you could build real apps on your desktop as well. The other thing that Flutter 2 brought along was Dart 2.12, which finally introduced sound null safety, which had been asked for by others. And because it's present in a lot of other languages like Rust and Kotlin and other things. And what it means is that things aren't null by default. Null doesn't always fit into a variable unless you've explicitly told Dart, yes, this variable can have a null in it, that's okay. But unlike previously, where anything that wasn't initialized yet had a null in it, now you had to initialize it because it had to have a value that wasn't null right to begin with. I know it's a little complicated to describe in a short talk, but it's all in there. So as Dart and Flutter continue to evolve, we keep seeing continuous improvement to Dart. And just as a metric, the changelog for Dart 2 now, I looked it up a couple days ago, so this might be wrong already, 7,800 lines of markdown for all the changes to all the different versions of Dart over time. And there have been some major new features. Enums have gotten a lot smarter. If you don't know what these are, sorry, I'm not teaching that part in this talk. It's too short for that. Collection literals got a lot smarter. That really saved a lot of work. And it's great because Dart keeps evolving to make it easier and easier to write code. And that's the key thing, is that this is not a static language. This is not that. Makes it harder on people who are writing books and stuff and training courses, because anything you publish today is out of date 6 months later, pretty much guaranteed. But that's live. That's why you spend a lot of time hanging out on community social networks, asking questions about Dart, because it's probably changed since the last time you looked. Type defs got to be the same way as they are in C. You can basically type def pretty much anything now. Flutter 3 came out in May of last year, and that brought out Dart 2.17, which had even more features. Again, the thing to take away from this is the development is never sitting still. And more of this development is being done by non-Google people. I think for Flutter 3, I think the figure I recall is 40% of the commits for Flutter 3 came from non-Google addresses, which means the community is really owning this now. The community is really like taking on Dart and Flutter. And how that's important to you is that even if Google decides tomorrow, we don't want to do Dart and Flutter anymore, it's all open source. It can be forked. People can carry forward on it. and not worry about it. And there's enough of a critical mass already in the industry and enough of a skill set already in the industry that I'm sure this would go on in some form or another. Flutter 3 also brought us stable support for all the platforms. So everything came up to not being just a preview release, but actually being stable releases, and introduced Apple Silicon, because this is about the time that M1s were being popular from Apple. So where are we at now? So just before the event that happened yesterday, we were at Flutter 3.3.10, which is a variant of 3, and Dart 2.18.6, which has more and more features, a bunch of minor ones that I didn't think fit on the slide, so I didn't put them in there. But that's kind of what we had up till yesterday. And this means we're running Dart on multiple platforms, even more than I mentioned at the beginning of the show. It runs Mac, Windows, Linux command line. It compiles to ARM, so that means you can compile for mobile devices. It compiles to x64, so that way I can load it on my laptop, and compiles to Silicon, so I can use Apple's new chips, both in the phone and on desktop. And by compiling, I should probably say that a Flutter program is not being turned into JavaScript and then interpreted as JavaScript on the phones. Instead, it's being compiled all the way down to ARM code directly. So it's running at machine level speeds, which actually makes it much more performance than the biggest competitor to Flutter when people think of cross-platform, which is React Native. React Native has to go through a JavaScript bridge, and it slows it way down compared to what Dart can do in Flutter. And Flutter is, again, pretty much on everything with a screen. So Mac, Windows, Linux, web, mobile, iOS, Android, Fuchsia, the Google Home unit, the home speaker and central controller, that's running Fuchsia now, which is a non-Linux operating system. I don't have time to do that, sorry. It runs embedded. It runs on Google Watches, but not Apple Watches. And there's a long story behind that. But also in-dash entertainment systems. So if you're buying a modern GM, or let's see, what's the other one, Toyota? It's a couple manufacturers now that for that in-dash entertainment system and manager thing, that's now being written using Dart and Flutter. So it's definitely impacted the industry and changed the way people are thinking about these devices. It's extremely portable. You could run the same code, predominantly so, on all these different platforms. So sometimes I'm developing for my phone, but it's easier to develop on desktop. So I'll actually code it and debug it and play with it on my desktop, and then drop it onto the mobile compiler, because that takes longer. So extremely portable, but you can also always include platform specific code. So on Flutter, we can talk to iOS and Android natively. On the Mac and Windows and Linux, we can talk to libc. So we can talk to everything that any other application running on those can do. And that got a little bit better as of yesterday as well. We'll get to that in a second. So after the event was yesterday, came from Kenya, and was very early in the morning here. It was 6 a.m. here. Anyway, so Flutter 3.7 got released about 12 hours before the event. I started playing with it as much as I could because I was distracted by how everything else is going on. But that also had Dart, a new version of Dart, but we'll get to that in a second. The design specifications that Google produces are called Material, and that's designed for mobile, for web, for desktop, and it's a way of having the buttons interact with each other and look. And Google has spent a ton of money on Material with their user interface experts trying to figure out what to do. But if you've ever played with an Android phone, that particular specific look is in fact material. But you can do the same thing with Flutter all the way down, and you can run material look stuff on iOS, on the web, anywhere, because it's a fully supported thing. And Material 3 is an evolution of that. So it got even smarter. We got things like cascading menus, context menus, right-click menus, and personalized color theming. If you want to set your phone to be mostly bluish, then you can have Flutter apps that respect that and kind of tune it more towards blue. Pretty cool. Faster rendering engine called Impeller. That's to get rid of some of the problems that we've had in making animations start smoothly on iOS, because the whole metal system that's used internally on iOS is pretty screwy for the kind of stuff that we wanted to do. And then Impeller is eventually going to come to Android, but one of the great things is it does 3D support. So we can actually start doing 3D games that have depth to them. Like imagine playing, a role-playing game, not a role-playing game, but like a first-person shooter, and you'll be able to do that with everything all being happening in real time, full speed. WebAssembly support. So that means that arbitrarily complex things can be executing in your browser. You might have heard of WASM before, in the respect of having something like a C code compiled down to essentially JavaScript and running in every browser. This is pretty good technology, pretty interesting technology, and it's coming along just far enough that we can target WASM as a target for Dart and for Flutter. So that'll be really cool. That, and also having Flutter not just take over the whole screen, but be an embedded element like a div somewhere within some other screen. And that's going to be cool when that starts rolling out. Some of this is experimental right now. Give it 6 months, so this will all be mature enough for production. Improvements to the fast function interface, foreign function interface, things called, to be able to, again, integrate well with the existing libc and other libraries that you may have that are written in other languages, including like a Rust interoperational thing, bunch of other stuff. So pretty cool. A news toolkit, so you can take data and make a news site out of it. And in fact, commercial news outfits are already using it to create the similar experiences on iOS, Android, and web with a minimal amount of coding. Pretty cool stuff. DevTools is sort of a way of looking at things like what widget is taking up the most space on my screen, and why is it doing that? What are its constructs? Also, how is my performance being impacted by certain operations that I might be doing? So DevTools got a huge upgrade in this release. And Dart came out as 2.19 yesterday, 2 days ago, actually now. And we also got a preview of what was going to be in Dart 3. And in fact, I'll talk more about Dart 3 in a moment, but there are some things in Dart 2.19 that are already installed now with Flutter 3.7 that we can play with. And I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing, though, is the RISC-V chip, RISC-V, I don't know if it's V or 5, is a really good small device, IoT devices, computing power, and performant and low power. So this is really good stuff. And the fact that we can target that with Dart code is going to be, again, another game changer, another whole area that Dart is going to be able to be used in, and therefore Flutter as well. But the most important thing is that one of the things that happened in Dart 2.19 is that it's now very easy to launch applications that are running in parallel with your main application. They run on a separate core. So if you have a multi-core machine, you can keep them all lit up and burning battery as fast as they can. That's kind of cool. And it's easy to manage, and it can actually also do all the plugin stuff. And that was also something that wasn't available before. But the takeaway from that is just that Dart is getting simpler to make programs that scale. And that means that Flutter is easier to develop for. And the Google teams are very, steadily working on both of those aspects continuously. So where's it going? Well, Dart 3 is coming out soon. There's already a Dart 3 alpha available. And one of the things it did is it dropped support for legacy Dart. So way back in the early days of Dart, again, variables weren't typed. So you could put an int into a variable that previously held a string. And the problem with that is that means that all the code that uses that variable has to say, is this a string or is this an int right now? And so there's a lot of extra code that gets generated to do all that. Once you get strong typing and sound typing, like we have in modern Dart, then we can generate a lot less code. They showed an example of something that was like 70 lines of code in ARM back in the old days, and now it's like 3 lines of code in ARM today. But the compilers had to carry around the ability to compile for the old technologies up until this release. Once this release hits, all that legacy stuff doesn't get supported anymore. So it's going to be a big break. But almost everybody that has needed to has already migrated to the new code anyway. So this is not really limiting many people, except people that should be maintaining their code anyway. Again, under the experimental flags, there are some new features that are really important to bring Dart into parity with other languages that are sort of in this space, like Rust and Kotlin and those guys, like records and destructuring, so tuples that have strong typing. This is the simplest way to think of this, is being able to return multiple values from a function at once, rather than just have a single type return. You can return a tuple that has 3 items in it, for example. Patterns and algebraic types. If you've done anything with Haskell or F# or any of those functional languages, you know what pattern matching is, and that's coming to Dart. So we'll be able to start doing much more interesting applications with that. And I'm glad it's getting added to the language. This stuff's all going to be out probably in about 6 months, but you can actually play with it now. Inline classes, class capabilities like sealed, so you can declare that a class can't have additional methods, things like that, so it can be locked down. And after that, we're finally going to get macros. So what macros are is static metaprogramming, basically a way to generate code, have the compiler generate code on the fly based on the code you're providing. And right now you can do that, but you have to do it with a separate build step. So what happens is you write code a particular way so that it can spit out more code, and then you run a process that basically does that part, and then the compiler actually runs the final code. But once macros get in place, all that middle step is going to be already in the compiler. So it's just a load and go kind of thing, instead of having to go through the separate steps. That's going to save us a lot of time, and it's going to actually make a bunch of features available that we couldn't do otherwise. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation. I've got some URLs here that, again, I'll give you the slide deck so that you can just click on this rather than having to write any of these down. I consulted a few times the Flutter breaking changes. This tells us what's actually changing as Flutter goes through its series of things. Flutter what's new is sort of the human version of that. These things have been changed. The Flutter roadmap just got updated for 2023 and includes things like what I've sort of been alluding to. That's great to kind of see where the Flutter team really wants to get from through this year, what kind of goals they will have for the end of the year. Dart also has an update, what's new. So you can see what's been changing from Dart 2.0 all the way up to Dart 2.19 and now 3, all in one convenient spot. And it has links to the details for pretty much everything. And there's also the language funnel. That's the equivalent of the roadmap for the Dart side. And that will tell you sort of what's already been implemented, what's still in progress, what's still being designed, what's being considered as you get further and further back in time, or further later in time, I guess. So it lets you know all those things there. And I have a YouTube channel, Randal on Dart and Flutter, with an @ in front of it. Again, you're going to get this anyway, so don't worry about writing down the links. That would be the end of my formal presentation. So let's open it up for questions. We've got 15 minutes for questions, so let's do it. Let me scroll here. Let's see. I got a DM. I don't know. Let's see here. Is it okay to read that, Navita? I mean, you wrote it directly to me. Okay, right. And her question was, or his question, sorry, I should not use pronouns. If we're working with others on a project using Flutter, what would you suggest is the best way to do that? Clearly, you're going to be, having like, shared change management like Git. There are strategies when you get a larger team where a new feature will go into its own folder to make sure that it touches the minimum number of folders so that you don't have merge conflicts. But for a small to medium team, that doesn't matter. I actually find organizing the application more along the lines of, here's my API management, here's the data transfer objects, here's the layer that's doing my repository, here's my business logic, and here's my views. I kind of see the layers that way a little bit easier. So again, that's also like, Emacs versus Vim or something like that. It's really a religious matter more than anything else. And so you'll see people arguing really strongly about architecture when in fact, really just get the data in there somewhere. And as long as you can find the stuff that you want to find and you've got a reasonable strategy for going one place or the other, that's probably enough. And let's see, in my opinion, that's just Siddharth saying this. In your opinion, do you think that the future Flutter Dart would be de facto frameworks for a career in UI design? Well, UI design is not my area. I'm a programmer. But if you mean in terms of being something that is managing the screen, and so you can give the screen a behavior and make it do useful things for you, I think Flutter is poised to be really well for at least the next 3 to 5 years. It would be great if something came along that was even better than Flutter. That I would just be thrilled. But I don't think so. I think with the kind of innovations that Google is continuing to do in terms of mutating and growing what Flutter can do and what Dart can do, it has a really great core, and a core that allows for this kind of growth and expansion. There's nothing there's not that much that's like legacy, like, boy, if we had started over, we would have done it differently. There's not a lot of that kind of regret going on in this stuff. So I'd say it's a pretty good basis to learn, and it will be everywhere. And there's 5 million Flutter programmers, as I said at the beginning of the slide deck. So it's definitely going to be intense there. Anybody else with questions? Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Did you get what you came for? Is anybody happy with the presentation?
Hey, Randall, I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, first off, yeah, thank you for the presentation because that was actually really interesting to hear about kind of the history of Flutter, right? I didn't see all that background on, but interesting how it ties into Dart and the design that came behind that.
Yep.
I've been interested in Dart and Flutter for almost a year now.
Okay.
So it's, as a student, it's just really interesting to kind of dabble in that while we're learning all this other stuff that doesn't really
Mhm.
usually come with like front end or software engineering. At least
Right.
in the curriculum here, that's what I've kind of observed. It's a lot more like operating systems, like architecture, right? Computer science, I guess. Um, but yeah, it's been really interesting for me then, and I've really been enjoying Flutter. And I wanted to ask you, maybe just if you can see from the perspective of us students, what do you think can like kind of get us to that proficiency in Flutter, like that professional level? Do you know if you have any resources maybe we can obtain, to really be able to create like our own quality apps?
There's one thing I'll say is, as I mentioned in the middle of the talk, Dart and Flutter are very fast moving objects. If you see a book on Dart or Flutter, it is out of date. Guaranteed. Do not buy a book. Do not buy even an e-copy of a book. It's that bad now because again, it's not like things break, but like earlier books describe harder ways to do things, and now there's a simpler way. And so you're learning lots and lots of useless information because it's been replaced by something even cooler and better already. So my rule of thumb that I give people in the absence of an expert sitting next to you telling you, yes, this is a good thing to read, is use 6 months as a cutoff. If you're looking at a video or a blog post on Dart or Flutter and it's older than 6 months, be cautious of it just because it changes that quickly. Now, once you get the basis of everything down, then you'll be able to sort of do that sorting out yourself. Okay, this is something that just happened, or this is something that happened 2 years ago, and I already know Firebase has a different interface now, that kind of thing. But it will take you some time to get to that skill level. In terms of learning languages, I stopped listing programming languages on my resume after like 50 of them. So I'm a big polyglot in terms of computer languages. And one of the things I've always believed is that the first thing you do when you're learning a new language is you read all the code you can that exists in that language and have at your side the reference documentation so that you can look things up or be on one of the social chats on Discord or Slack to be able to ask, what does this do? When you're reading the code, you don't understand how that works. And that will give you best practices, that will give you idioms, that will give you just sort of the general feel for layout and design of the app, architecture, all that stuff. But read other people's code. That's going to make you probably better the quickest. It's and like I said, it's unfortunate that pretty much everything that's in print is out of date, and even things that are online go out of date fairly quickly. Like I have a couple of videos in the YouTube channel that are invalid as of yesterday because of the things that were said. So all of a sudden, this thing that was I published only 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, is now nope, doesn't matter. So I have to go back in and put comments on those in the YouTube to say these aren't useful anymore. I don't know. Did that answer your question, or am I just rambling too much now?
No, yeah, that was great. Yeah, I've And I
Okay.
understand, yeah, because I even with the little, I've been trying out and learning, I've definitely seen that it's moving fast and like looking up a problem, and you really got to be careful, like how old whatever the Stack Overflow was posted, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, thank you for that point. I definitely want to remember to look at more code
Yep.
for sure. Yeah, and by the way, I think I do recall I recognize you from the Discord, the Flutter Dev Discord. So I was like,
I'm there a lot.
it's
I'm there too
familiar.
much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, well, thank you so much again, Randall.
Cool. All right. Any other questions? Which skills required to use Flutter? Um, let's see. You need to know Dart, but you can learn Dart slowly. I have, well, my recommendations are that there's some things on the Dart Dev website that include the language tour. You should read that. It takes about an hour and a half to read through, but it gives you the basic sense of what Dart is as a language and will help you understand that you probably already know a lot of the concepts already. Dart wasn't designed to be a difficult language to learn, but it also wasn't designed with only baby steps in mind. So it's kind of in the middle somewhere. So you read the Dart language tour, you skim the Dart library tour, which gives you at least get a sense of what's already available in the included libraries. And then there are a series of code labs, which is Google's name for some exercises that you can do on your own, and it'll be guided to get through them. So you do the Dart code labs, then you go over to the Flutter, and there's similar things for Flutter. So there's a Flutter overview. There's some detailed things on Flutter, but there's also Flutter code labs that, again, you should attempt because it will give you a sense of what else you need to know, because the code labs are pretty gradually, getting more and more difficult as they go through them. And then the other thing you should do is there's a cookbook on Flutter, and that basically has about, I don't know, 50 different tasks and how to do each one of those in Flutter. And again, you don't have to learn all the things that are in the cookbook. Cookbook's always going to be there, but you should get a understanding of the titles and areas that the cookbook covers. And that'll give you a sense of what to go look up and stuff. So I would say do the Dart and the Flutter Dev websites first, because those are written by Google. They're really high quality. And I say this as someone who's written a bunch of books myself. So what they've done is amazing. And then given that it's all right there and it's kept up to date, the Google document people are talking to the Google devs and keeping things in sync so they all roll out at the same time. Very smart stuff. Yep. Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Getting close to the end of the official slide here. Last chance. Hurry up. Flutter community is amazing. Oh, go to flutter.dev/community and you'll see the links for the Discord, the Slack. You'll see the keywords to use in Stack Overflow. You'll see that there are Reddit channels for this. And I read all those in my role as a GDE. I read all those. And so if you ask a question in one of those places, I may be the one to answer it. So be prepared for that. You might see me even more. Yeah, but get plugged into the community. If you're going to be doing this at all in any serious sort of way, definitely get plugged into the community, because I think right now there are something like 3,000 people on the Flutter Discord alone. I mean, and that's covered 24/7. There's always somebody there that can answer your questions. How would you make sure you're using all the features of Flutter? Nobody uses all the features of Flutter. I'm still learning new features of Flutter every day. So no. Somebody asked me, how long does it take to learn Flutter? And I just simply replied, the rest of your life. Because there's no better answer. It's going to be something that is always, I mean, even me, I'm devoting most of my waking hours to Flutter. I don't know the whole thing. Nobody does. All of my expert friends all tell me the same thing. They say it's so weird because we know these things, but we don't know it all. And I go, yeah, and I know these things, and I don't know it all. And it's a good thing we can chat with each other and kind of fill each other in, because there's just so much to know and learn and specialize in, but do what's interesting. What do you think of the security of Flutter applications? Flutter applications can be locked down just like any other application. And yes, if you make mistakes, you can leak. It's really nothing different there. There's nothing more unusual about it than developing with any other architecture. Let's see, anything more here. Oh, I think that's caught up. Last chance, hurry up, ask questions. Tick, 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 tick. Hopefully my sniffling didn't upset too many people here. I've been somehow managed to get a cold just before this. Hope it's just a cold. Hope it's not COVID. I've been shot. I think it should be okay. When should you use keys? You know, there's a video on that. If you go to the keys, if you go to the key page, is it key or keys? Key, the key page, the key class. There's a wonderful video done by somebody who I've met in person, talking about when to use keys. Keys are the way that, what's the shortest way to describe this? So your application is going to be going down through all of your hierarchy of widgets 60 times a second, say. But you don't want to have to keep rebuilding everything. So one of the things that can happen is a widget might get eliminated out of a list or get added to a list. Well, how does it know that the other widgets are still the same and don't need to be rebuilt? And that's done by giving a widget a key. So the key lets it compare the old view and the new view. And if they're the same, then it goes, oh, I can reuse this widget here. But if a new widget has a key that it's never seen before, then it knows it has to build it from scratch. So it's typically used with lists where you're inserting things. It can also be used for forms if you want to get access to the form. It's really just sort of a unique handle on a widget so that you can point back at it for various technologies. When something needs a key, it lets you know. It says, I need a key here for the widget you're trying to talk about. So it's right there. Yeah, cool. All right, right up against 8:30. Time to start winding down. So thank you all for letting me stop by and talk a bit and go forth and be fluttery. That would be the best.